The parents abandoned the boy because he had a large birthmark, but when he grew up.
Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Mrs. Rose held her breath. An old cardboard box lay wedged between two garbage bins. It wasn't large, but just big enough to hold something small inside. She slowly bent down, her hands trembling as she pulled aside the torn cloth covering it. A baby. A little boy, thin and shivering beneath the flimsy fabric. He was so small, perhaps not even a year old. His eyes were shut tight, his tiny face pale from the cold. But what shocked Rose the most wasn't the frailty of the child, it was the large red birthmark spreading across his face and neck. The birthmark was so big, anyone would be startled at the sight of it. "Oh Lord," Rose gasped, her hands shaking as she touched the baby's tiny body. He was ice cold, his breathing so faint that she had to lean in close just to be sure he was still alive. Unbelievable. Who could abandon a child in such a desolate place, on a freezing winter night? Rose looked around. Not a single soul. Only darkness and the eerie silence of the alley. Her chest tightened. Should she call the police? Maybe they would find the baby's parents. Or take him to some child welfare center. But then, another thought crossed her mind: if the baby had been abandoned, was there a chance his parents never wanted to find him again? She looked at the child once more. He stirred slightly, his tiny hands trying to grasp whatever warmth remained from the thin fabric. "I can't leave you here," Rose murmured, her voice heavy with sorrow. She took off the old wool scarf from around her neck and gently wrapped it around the baby, pulling him close to her chest. A little warmth passed from her body to his. A strong gust of wind blew through, carrying with it the stench of garbage and dust. She couldn't hesitate any longer. She hurried out of the alley, heading toward the boarding house where she lived. On the way back, Rose passed by a small bar. Flashing neon lights blinked, the pounding music mixing with the loud laughter and shouting of drunken patrons. A tall man stumbled out of the bar, swaying from alcohol. It was Albert, an unemployed man who lived off welfare checks and loans he never paid back. He saw Rose and frowned when he noticed she was holding something in her arms. "Hey, old lady, what's that you've got there?" He smirked, his voice slurred. "None of your business," Rose replied shortly, trying to walk faster. But Albert wouldn't let it go. "Humph, a baby, huh?" He sneered, stepping closer. "Where'd you pick that up?" "From the trash." Rose glared at him. "Get out of my way, Albert. I don't have time for your nonsense." "Ha! Who do you think you are?" He scoffed, but then his eyes landed on the baby's face. Immediately, the smirk vanished from his lips. "Holy shit! What the hell is that?" He took a step back, his face twisted in fear. Rose tightened her hold on the child. "The boy hasn't done anything to hurt anyone. But he looks freaky," Albert stammered. "You're crazy, Rose. Don't bring him back here. You're gonna get yourself in trouble." Rose didn't answer. She only walked faster. The baby nestled closer to her chest, seeking warmth. No matter what, she couldn't abandon him. When she reached the boarding house, Rose hurriedly unlocked her door and switched on the small lamp by the bed. The room was poor, with only a few old belongings, but at least it wasn't as cold as out there. She gently laid the baby on the bed, wrapping him in another thin blanket. The boy opened his eyes slightly, gazing at her with big, round, weak eyes. Rose sighed. "Little one, where did you come from?" Of course, there was no answer. She sat down and looked at him for a long time. Then she softly whispered, "Matthew. I'll call you Matthew." For the first time in many years, she felt her heart warm just a little. But she didn't know that this decision would change her life forever. In a luxurious mansion in the Upper East Side where only the wealthiest families in New York City could afford to live, Samuel Carter stood pensively in front of a large window, his cold, sharp eyes gazing down at the vast garden stretching all the way to the main gate. The light from the crystal chandelier reflected off his chiseled face, casting shadows that made his features seem both dignified and unapproachable. Behind him, Camille Walker, his wife, a beautiful yet shrewd woman, sat on a red velvet chair, her slender fingers clutching tightly at the armrest. The spacious room was filled with expensive furnishings, but the air inside felt heavy, as if something invisible was strangling the space. "Has he taken care of it yet?" Camille asked, her voice trembling slightly. Samuel didn't answer right away. He drew a cigar from a silver box on the table and slowly lit it. The rich scent of tobacco mingled with the fragrance of Camille's expensive perfume. "I told Henry to take it himself," Samuel finally said, his voice even but carrying a chilling coldness. "He assured me there would be no trace left behind." Camille shuddered. Though she knew her husband was a ruthless man, she still couldn't help but feel afraid. "What if someone finds it?" she asked, biting her lip nervously. Samuel sneered, a glint of contempt flashing in his eyes. "Camille, what are you thinking? It's just a child. No one cares about an abandoned baby left in a filthy alley." Camille said nothing. She shakily poured herself a glass of wine and downed it in one gulp. But even the strong liquor couldn't wash away the panic twisting in her chest. Over a year ago, the day Camille gave birth to the baby, her life turned upside down. When the doctor placed the child in her arms, instead of feeling love like other mothers, all she felt was horror. A red birthmark covered a large part of the baby's face and neck. It looked like an enormous burn, as if someone had tried to scorch half of the tiny face from the moment he was born. Camille panicked. "This isn't my child," she screamed, almost throwing the baby onto the bed. The nurses hurried over. A middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair, likely the head doctor, tried to calm her down. "Mrs. Camille, please calm down. It's just a birthmark, it's not dangerous." "Not dangerous?" Camille shrieked, her voice cracking. "You're telling me a child with a face like this is normal?" The doctor was momentarily stunned. But she quickly regained her professional composure and tried to explain. "Ma'am, modern medicine can help improve." "No. I don't want to hear it." Camille covered her ears with her hands, tears streaming down her face. "This is a bad omen. A curse." Those around her exchanged helpless glances, not knowing what to do. At that moment, Samuel walked into the room. His eyes swept over the baby lying in the white cradle. Silence descended. It was a long time before Samuel finally spoke. "We won't keep him." Camille looked up, bewildered. What did you say?" "I can't let a child like this damage our family's reputation," Samuel said calmly. "You know how much importance the upper class places on appearances. A baby with a birthmark that big will have everyone talking." Camille pressed her lips together tightly. Samuel stepped closer to her, leaning down to whisper. "Think carefully, Camille. Do you want all of New York City to know that our son looks like a monster?" That very night, Samuel contacted an adoption center. But because they didn't have the legal documents, they were rejected. In the days that followed, Camille sank deeper into anxiety. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly. Every time she heard the baby's cries, it felt as if someone was tightening a noose around her neck. She couldn't take it anymore. "I can't live like this." Camille exploded one night. "We have to get rid of it." Samuel looked at her, his eyes devoid of any emotion. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." Camille screamed. "Can't you see? That is not a normal child. It's a bad omen. A disgrace." Samuel nodded slowly. "All right." He called Henry, their loyal chauffeur, the man who was always ready to take care of the tasks Samuel didn't want to dirty his hands with. On a moonless night, Henry drove to the entrance of a dark alley. He opened the trunk of the car and quietly lifted the baby, who was sleeping soundly. Without a moment's hesitation, Henry placed him on the ground, right beside a garbage bin. Cold. Alone. He glanced at the child one last time, then turned away, walking quickly back to the car. The engine roared to life. The car rolled away, leaving a tiny, fragile life behind. Back in the present, Camille sat curled up in a chair, her hands trembling as she clutched a glass of wine. "Do you think someone will find him?" she asked weakly. Samuel shrugged. "Maybe. But it doesn't matter anymore. He has nothing to do with us." Camille said nothing. She closed her eyes, trying to erase the image of the baby with the red birthmark on his face. But no matter how hard she tried, that image clung to her like a ghost. A clap of thunder boomed outside. The wind howled against the windows. And even inside the luxurious mansion, in a warm room filled with every comfort, Camille still felt cold to the bone. New York City was still freezing cold, the sky gray and heavy as if the sun had never existed. The icy wind slipped through every crack, creeping into the old walls of the rundown boarding house where Mrs. Rose lived. In the small, damp room, the faint glow of the lamp lit up two figures sitting close together. On the old single bed, Matthew curled up under the thin blanket. He was so tiny, his body frail and weak, but the warmth from Rose seemed to help ease his shivering. She had spent the entire night warming Matthew, using her breath to keep the boy from succumbing to the bitter cold of the New York City night. Rose tiredly rubbed her calloused hands together, her eyes lined with crow's feet from years of hardship. She sighed. "Little one, where did you come from? Who could be so cruel as to leave you out there in the winter night like that?" Of course, there was no answer. Matthew was still fast asleep, his breathing weak but steady. Rose gently stroked his tiny face, her gaze lingering on the large, blotchy red birthmark covering his face and neck. She frowned slightly. That birthmark. It wasn't something people could easily overlook. It was too big, too noticeable, and she understood that the world would never see him as just an ordinary child. She took a deep breath. Tomorrow, she would have to take Matthew outside. She would have to face the stares, the whispers, the looks of contempt. She was used to society's coldness. But Matthew wasn't. The next morning, when Rose led Matthew out of her room at the boarding house, she immediately felt the stares aimed in their direction. Mrs. Connie, an old woman who lived in the room across the hall, was wiping her window. But when she saw Matthew, she froze. Her eyes widened, then quickly narrowed. "Holy Mary," she mumbled, raising her hand to make the sign of the cross. Rose pretended not to hear, pulling Matthew closer to her chest. Stepping down the stairs, she passed Mr. Stephen, a middle-aged man who sold newspapers on the street corner. He was chatting with a few neighbors, but the moment his eyes landed on Matthew, he abruptly stopped. He frowned, then shot Rose a malicious look. "What's that old woman dragging home this time?" he sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. A woman standing beside him, Mrs. Beatrice, the wife of a government official, curled her lip in disgust. "I told you already. She's always been strange. Who in their right mind would just bring home a freakish child like that?" The birthmark on his face, Stephen lowered his voice to a whisper. "I've heard stories about cursed children. What if he's—" "Hush. Don't say such things." Beatrice shuddered, but her eyes stayed glued to Matthew with unmistakable fear. Rose stopped in her tracks, clenching her fists. She knew exactly what they were saying. They didn't even bother to hide their revulsion. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it all aside and continued walking. But she had only taken a few steps when a voice called out behind her. "She's brought bad luck here." This time, Rose couldn't ignore it. She turned around, her sharp gaze locking onto Mr. Stephen. "What did you just say?" Her voice was low, but full of authority. Stephen flinched for a moment, but then he lifted his chin in defiance. "We all see it, Mrs. Rose. That child is not normal. Who knows what he'll bring?" "Ridiculous." Rose scoffed. "A helpless, innocent child, and you can't even leave him be? Don't you have anything better to do?" "That child isn't normal," Beatrice repeated, her voice trembling. "That birthmark, it's too big. Who knows what it means?" Rose's hands tightened, but she knew there was no point arguing with them. She pulled Matthew closer and lowered her head, walking away quickly. But her heart was heavy. She understood one thing: life was never going to be easy for Matthew. In the days that followed, the prejudice only became more obvious. When Rose brought Matthew to the market to buy groceries, the vendors stopped talking the moment she approached. They glanced at Matthew from the corners of their eyes, then busied themselves with something else, as if they wanted to avoid any contact at all. Another time, when she took Matthew to the pharmacy to buy some formula, the pharmacist Mr. Vincent stared at Matthew for a long moment before whispering to one of his employees. "Look at him. He's frightening." Rose heard it. Everyone in the store heard it. But no one said a word. Matthew was still too young to understand, but Rose knew that one day, he would realize how cold the world could be toward him. It broke her heart. She only wanted to give Matthew a peaceful life, but that seemed impossible. That night, after Rose laid Matthew down on the bed, she sat and watched him for a long time. He was still so innocent. He didn't know yet that the world outside had already turned its back on him. She stroked his head gently, her voice as soft as a whisper in the wind. "No matter what happens, I will protect you." She didn't know how long she could keep that promise. But she knew one thing: she would never give up on Matthew. Winter slowly passed, but the cold clung stubbornly to New York City like a persistent ghost. The rare rays of spring sunlight weren't enough to warm the old streets where Rose continued to quietly sweep every day, trying to earn enough money to support their simple life together. Matthew had grown a little, but the change on his face was still impossible to hide. The red birthmark stretched from his right cheek down to his neck, making anyone who saw him turn away, even though Rose knew he had done nothing wrong. But this society, when had it ever been fair to the weak? And today, Rose knew that a new chapter, one full of hardship, was waiting for Matthew. His first day of school. That morning, Rose woke up earlier than usual. She carefully brushed Matthew's hair and dressed him in the old school uniform she had saved for over a month to afford. It wasn't new, and it wasn't as nice as the clothes the other children would wear, but at least it was clean and neatly pressed. Matthew looked at himself eagerly in the small mirror hanging on the wall. He didn't notice the worry hidden behind Rose's tired, shadowed eyes. "Grandma, do you think I'll make friends?" Matthew asked in a small voice, his clear eyes shining with hope. Rose froze for a moment. She wanted to say, "Of course, everyone makes friends," but the words stuck in her throat. She knew, it wouldn't be easy for Matthew to have a friend. But instead of telling him the harsh truth, she smiled and gently patted his head. "Of course, sweetheart. Who wouldn't want to be friends with such a kind boy like you?" Matthew beamed, his eyes crinkling in joy. And Rose's heart clenched tighter than ever. When Rose took Matthew to school, she immediately felt the stares fixated on the two of them. The first to notice them was Mrs. Caroline, an elegant woman, mother to one of the students in Matthew's class. She froze as soon as her eyes landed on him, then quickly pulled her child back, as if Matthew was something terrifying. Other parents soon began whispering. "Who's that kid? Did she adopt him or something? Look at his face. Holy Mary. Don't tell me he's going to be in class with my child." Rose heard every word they said. She tightened her grip on Matthew's hand. Matthew didn't understand what was happening. He still looked around with curiosity, his eyes wide with excitement, taking in the new world of school for the first time. But that joy didn't last long. A child nearby, James, the son of a wealthy businessman, pointed at Matthew and shouted loudly. "Mom! Look at his face. What's wrong with him?" Immediately, the other children turned to look. Some giggled. Others stepped back, avoiding him as if Matthew carried some kind of disease. Matthew was confused. He instinctively raised his hand to touch his own face. "Is there something wrong with me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Caroline pulled James away, but not before shooting Matthew a look of disgust. "Stay away from him, James. You don't want to get cursed." Cursed. Rose felt like someone had just squeezed all the air out of her lungs. She took a deep breath and knelt down, whispering softly to Matthew. "Don't pay attention to them, sweetheart. Come on, I'll take you to your class." Matthew didn't understand what was going on, but he obediently held Rose's hand as they walked through the school gates. Yet, as soon as they were out of sight, the whispers behind them flared up again. "My God, how can the school accept a child like that? They probably don't know. Someone should tell the principal." The classroom was bright, flooded with sunlight. The children laughed and chatted happily, their desks neatly arranged, colorful drawings hanging on the walls. But the atmosphere instantly changed the moment Matthew stepped inside. The homeroom teacher, Miss Valerie, a young woman with long brown hair, froze the moment she saw him. She looked at Matthew for a long moment, then quickly regained her composure. "Hello there, what's your name?" she asked. Matthew looked up and politely answered. "My name is Matthew, ma'am." Valerie nodded, but her eyes couldn't hide a flicker of hesitation. "All right, Matthew. You can take that seat over there." Matthew smiled brightly and hurried over to the empty desk by the window. But no one sat next to him. The other children quietly shifted their chairs away, as if being too close to Matthew might somehow make them dirty. James, the boy from earlier, leaned over and whispered to his friend. "He's gotta be a monster for real." Matthew heard it. He lowered his head and clenched his small hands into fists. But he didn't say anything. No one told him he had to accept those words. Yet somehow, he understood that he couldn't fight back. He didn't have the right. He didn't have the strength. He was just a child the world had already cast aside. That day's lesson passed in stifling silence for Matthew. No one played with him. No one spoke to him. Even the teacher avoided meeting his gaze. When school was over, Matthew walked slowly toward the school gate, his worn-out shoes dragging along the ground. Rose was already there waiting for him. When she saw Matthew's lowered head, she didn't need to ask to know what had happened. She gently pulled him into a hug. "How was your first day?" she asked softly. Matthew stayed silent for a long time. Then he whispered. "I don't think they like me, Grandma." Rose hugged him tighter. She didn't know how she could protect Matthew from such a cruel world. But she knew one thing, she would never leave him. The days that followed Matthew's first day of school were heavy, as if every morning when he woke up, he had to put on an invisible suit of armor just to endure the scorn of the world. No matter how hard Rose tried to protect him, she couldn't shield him from every whisper, every fearful glance, or every cold shoulder society turned on him. But what made life most miserable for the two of them wasn't the children at school or the prejudiced neighbors. It was Mr. George. Mr. George was the landlord of the boarding house where Rose rented their small room. He was in his 50s, short and overweight, his face deeply lined from a bitter life. He used to be a carpenter, but after his father died and left him the building, he hadn't lifted a finger for any kind of real work since. He liked giving orders. He liked being in control. And more than anything he hated Matthew. From the very first time he laid eyes on the boy, Mr. George had made no effort to hide his disgust. "Rose, what the hell did you bring home?" he said, standing with his arms crossed in front of her door, his eyes inspecting Matthew from head to toe. "A kid with that face?" Rose clenched her fists, but she kept her voice steady. Matthew is my grandson. He's staying with me. No, Mr. George bared his teeth. I won't allow you to bring bad luck into my boarding house. Bad luck? Rose narrowed her eyes, her voice dropping lower. He's just a child, George. An innocent child. Innocent? Ha! He let out a bitter laugh. Don't you see? Haven't you heard what people are saying? A child with a red mark like that, he's not normal. He's going to bring misfortune on all of us. Nonsense. Rose raised her voice. Where did you get such foolish ideas? Mr. George shrugged, his lips curling into a sneer. Just look around, old woman. Ever since you brought him here, everything's gotten worse. Mrs. Connie's fallen ill. Mr. Stephen's daughter broke her leg. Mrs. Beatrice's shop has been losing business. Do you really think that's all a coincidence? Rose wanted to scream. She wanted to slap the ignorant fool right across the face. But she knew, nothing would change the mind of someone blinded by superstition and fear. All she could do was grit her teeth, pull Matthew toward their room, and slam the door shut. But she knew this wasn't over. From that day on, Mr. George didn't stop making life harder for them. He raised their rent without warning. He cut the electricity to Rose's room and made her beg him to fix it. He threatened to throw them out of the boarding house unless she paid him extra to compensate for the bad luck he claimed Matthew was bringing. Don't think I'll let this slide, Rose, he said smugly one evening when she returned from work. If you don't pay me on time, you and that little freak are out of here. Rose had had enough. We'll leave, she said firmly. As soon as I find somewhere else. Mr. George chuckled cruelly. And where exactly do you think that'll be? Who's going to rent a room to you with a kid like that? Rose didn't answer. She just clenched her fists tighter, pulled Matthew inside, and shut the door behind them. But in the dark, she knew he was right. No one wanted to rent to her. No one wanted to be near Matthew. And she didn't have enough money to find another place. While Rose was struggling with Mr. George, Matthew became more withdrawn. He didn't smile as much as he used to. He didn't ask questions the way he used to. He was starting to fear the world outside. One time, Rose found him curled up in the corner of the room, silent tears streaming down his cheeks. She knelt down and gently pulled him into her arms. Matthew, sweetheart, what's wrong? Matthew looked up at her, his wide eyes full of pain. I heard them, his voice cracked. I heard them say I'm a monster. Rose's heart shattered. She fought back her tears and hugged him tighter. No one has the right to say that about you, she whispered. You're Matthew. You're a wonderful little boy. Matthew shook his head. But why is everyone afraid of me? Rose didn't know how to answer. She couldn't tell Matthew that the world was full of cruelty. That people were always afraid of what they didn't understand. That they could be merciless enough to shove an innocent child into the shadows because of a birthmark. She couldn't tell him that some prejudices never changed. So instead, she just held him close. And as the streetlights outside the window flickered, the darkness inside their tiny room felt heavier than ever. But then, the worst day came. One night, while Rose was working in a large building, she collapsed right in the middle of the lobby. When she woke up, she was lying in bed, inside their cold little room. Matthew was sitting beside her, his eyes red and swollen. Grandma, please don't leave me, he whispered. Rose tried to smile. I won't leave you, Matthew. But she knew. She couldn't go on like this forever. She was too tired. Too exhausted. And as she struggled to stay conscious, a terrifying thought crossed her mind. If she fell, who would protect Matthew? New York City kept spinning in its endless cycle, but for Matthew, time seemed to stand still. The days after Rose collapsed were the most terrifying of his life. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know who to ask for help. He was just a 6-year-old boy, completely alone in a cruel world. That morning, Rose was still lying in bed. Her face was paler than ever, deep lines etched into her skin, her eyes sunken with exhaustion. But even in her frailty, she managed a faint smile when she saw Matthew sitting anxiously beside her. "Matthew, don't worry about me," her voice was hoarse. But the boy couldn't help worrying. Rose was all he had. If she disappeared. He didn't dare finish the thought. "Grandma, can I go find someone to help?" Matthew asked hesitantly. But Rose shook her head. "No, Matthew. We can't trust anyone." Her words, though spoken gently, were the harshest truth. They had no one to rely on. No one wanted to help them. No one wanted to be near a child like Matthew. Matthew sat by her bedside for a long time, until Rose finally drifted into sleep from exhaustion. He clenched his small fists. "I have to do something." He remembered that whenever Rose felt unwell, she took medicine. He remembered that she used to buy it from the pharmacy nearby. So, he decided he would go get medicine for her. He would help her. He had to help her. He couldn't lose her. Matthew put on his old coat and left their small room, heading out into the street. The morning sun peeked weakly over the old rooftops, but he didn't feel any warmth at all. He walked through the familiar streets, where every step outside always brought him judgmental stares and cruel whispers. But this time, he didn't care. He had only one goal: to buy medicine for his grandma. When he reached the pharmacy, Matthew stepped inside hesitantly. Behind the counter stood Mr. Vincent, the owner of the pharmacy. The moment he saw Matthew, he froze. What do you need?" His voice held no kindness at all. Matthew swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. I want to buy medicine for my grandma." Vincent frowned. "What's wrong with her?" She's very tired. She can't get out of bed." Vincent stared at the boy for a long moment. Then he gave a cold, dismissive chuckle. "Listen, kid. I can't sell medicine to a child like you. Do you even have any money?" Matthew opened his hand, revealing only a few small, worn coins in his palm. Vincent sneered. "That's not nearly enough." Matthew felt as if someone had just punched him hard in the chest. "But I need medicine for my grandma," he said softly. "That's not my problem," Vincent shrugged. Matthew bit his lip. He wanted to beg. But Vincent's cold eyes told him everything. No matter how much he cried or pleaded, it wouldn't change anything. He lowered his head, clenched his small fist around the coins, and turned to run out of the pharmacy. But just as he stepped through the door, a voice called out behind him. "Hey! Look who it is!" Matthew froze. He recognized that voice. James. The boy was standing there with a group of other kids, all of them staring at Matthew with mocking eyes. "Can you believe it? He's actually outside." James laughed loudly. Another boy, David, crossed his arms and squinted at Matthew. "I thought you'd be hiding in your house forever." Matthew lowered his head and tried to walk faster. But they weren't going to let him go that easily. James stepped forward and blocked his path. "Where are you going, freak?" Matthew pressed his lips together and said nothing. James smirked. "Not gonna answer. I think you'd be better off disappearing." David burst out laughing. "Yeah. You're bad luck, you know that. Nobody wants to see your ugly face." Matthew felt like his heart was being crushed. He was used to cruel words. But today, they didn't just talk. James reached out and shoved Matthew hard. The boy fell to the ground, scraping his knees, blood trickling down his fragile skin. He bit his lip, trying hard not to cry. But they didn't stop. David kicked Matthew's old backpack, spilling the few coins he had brought with him onto the ground. "Look at this. He's so poor, this is all he's got." The kids around them erupted in laughter. Matthew trembled. Their laughter thundered in his head. He stared at the ground, his small fists clenched so tight they turned white. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. But his legs wouldn't move. James crouched down and yanked the cap off Matthew's head. "Ha! I don't think this belongs to you," he jeered. Then he threw it into a filthy puddle nearby. Matthew stared at the cap. It was the one Grandma Rose had bought for him. His only cap. He felt his vision blur as tears welled up in his eyes. But he didn't cry. He simply picked up the cap, water dripping from the soaked fabric as he held it in his small hands. Then he looked up at James. For the first time, there was no fear in his eyes. Only emptiness. James flinched for a moment. He wasn't used to that look. "Get out of here, freak," he shouted, but his voice no longer carried the same confidence as before. Matthew said nothing. He just turned around and slowly walked away. The cap, still dripping with filthy water, hung limply from his hand. Blood continued to seep from his scraped knee. But this time, he didn't feel the pain. He didn't feel anything at all. Because, deep inside his heart, something had died forever. Matthew dragged his small feet along the cracked stone sidewalk, his empty eyes staring ahead, though he wasn't really seeing anything. His little legs were exhausted, his wounded knee leaving a trail of dark red drops on the cold ground, soaking into the gray stones as if the street itself was swallowing them whole. The cap in his hand was still wet, dirty water dripping steadily onto his thin, trembling fingers. But he didn't bother wiping it away. He didn't have the strength to care anymore. He didn't know how long or how far he had walked. He only knew that with every step, he seemed to be dragging along a heavy weight of sorrow that pressed down on his small shoulders. In the distance, a streetlight flickered faintly in the cold mist of New York City, casting a pale glow over the face of a lonely child abandoned by the world. That 6-year-old boy was silently wondering why he even existed. At the entrance of the boarding house, Matthew stopped. He looked up at the old, worn door in front of him, his hand trembling as he placed it on the handle. He knew that as soon as he opened it, Grandma Rose would be waiting inside, asking him where he had been, if something had happened. But he didn't want to talk. He didn't want to make her worry any more. He didn't want her to know that the world had truly crushed him. He took a deep breath, trying to gather whatever little strength he had left. Then he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Rose was sitting on the bed. Her face was pale, but her eyes lit up when she saw Matthew return. "Matthew! Where have you been all morning?" Her voice was weak, but full of concern. Matthew lowered his head, his small hands clenching tightly into the hem of his shirt. I just went for a walk," he murmured. Rose squinted at him. She didn't believe it. She saw the soaked cap in his hand. She saw the bleeding wound on his knee. And more than anything, she saw that Matthew's eyes had changed. The innocence was gone. The hope was gone. There was no longer any light that should have belonged to a child. Only resignation. Rose felt her heart tighten painfully in her chest. She wanted to ask him what had happened. But she knew if he didn't want to speak, she couldn't force him. So instead, she quietly waved him over. "Come here, sweetheart. Let me take a look." Matthew obediently walked to her, letting her clean the wound on his knee. Her hands, though rough and worn, were gentler than anything else in the world. He wanted to cry. But he had promised himself he would never cry again. In the days that followed, Matthew barely left the house. He stopped going to school. He no longer went to the market with Rose. He avoided everyone, locking himself away in the small room, drawing on scraps of paper that Rose had found for him. He didn't draw the sun. He didn't draw blue skies. He only drew what he felt. Dark colors. Chaotic lines. Twisted shapes no one could understand. But Rose understood. She knew that her little grandson was silently screaming inside. And she didn't know how to pull him out of that darkness. Then, the worst happened. One evening, Rose wasn't feeling well. She thought if she rested for a while, she'd feel better by morning. But the exhaustion grew heavier and heavier, as if something or someone was draining the life from her. She tried to stand up. But the moment she rose from the bed, the room spun wildly around her. Everything turned black. And then she collapsed. Matthew woke with a start at the heavy sound of Rose's body hitting the floor. He rushed to her side, panic taking over as he shook her gently. "Grandma. What's wrong?" There was no answer. "Grandma. Please, don't leave me." His voice cracked as he cried out, his small hands trembling as he shook her harder. Tears spilled down his cheeks, even though he had promised himself he would never cry again. But Rose didn't wake up. Matthew was frantic. He didn't know what to do. He ran out of the room, down the hallway of the boarding house, pounding on door after door. "Please. Help my grandma. Please," he shouted. No one opened their door. No one answered. No one cared. He ran downstairs, desperate, searching for Mr. George, the only person who might be able to help. But when Matthew burst into his office, Mr. George only frowned in annoyance. "What the hell are you doing, kid? My grandma, she won't wake up. Please, you have to help her." Matthew's voice shook, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Mr. George didn't move. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned against the desk, staring Matthew up and down. Then he shrugged. "Not my problem." Matthew felt as if someone had slammed a fist straight into his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "But my grandma, she could die. You can't." Mr. George's mouth twisted into a cold, cruel smile. "Maybe that's for the best. A sick old woman and a cursed little brat, this world doesn't need the likes of you." Matthew stood frozen. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand. How could adults be this cruel? How could they leave someone to die, like they were nothing more than garbage? He wanted to scream. He wanted to shout at him, to tell him that he was the monster, not Matthew. But he had no strength left. All he could do was run, tears streaming down his small face. He ran through dark alleys, past rundown neighborhoods, beneath dim, flickering streetlights. Because he knew. He and Grandma Rose were truly alone in this world. And tonight might be the last night he would ever have her by his side. Matthew sat by her bed, clutching her thin, frail hand. His eyes were swollen red from lack of sleep, from fear, from the crushing hopelessness that had seeped into every corner of his small soul. The entire night, he had tried to wake her. He had run through the boarding house, pounding on every door. But no one answered. He had begged Mr. George to help. But the man had only sneered and slammed the door in his face. He had cried. He had screamed. But no one cared. And then, as the first light of dawn crept through the small window, Rose stirred. She wasn't dead. "Matthew," she whispered weakly. The boy jolted, then threw himself into her arms. "Grandma. I thought you'd never wake up." Rose gave him a faint smile, her trembling hand brushing through his messy hair. "I'm still here, sweetheart." Matthew wanted to cry. But this time, he didn't cry because of sadness. He cried because she was still alive. But Matthew knew they couldn't go on like this. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't live under Mr. George's threats, surrounded by neighbors who turned their backs on them, in a world that had shut them out. He had to do something. He had to change their fate. And then, an opportunity appeared. A few days later, as Matthew was walking past the small square near the boarding house, he saw a group of street artists painting. Their works were full of color, bursting with light completely different from the dark world he had grown used to. He stopped, watching every stroke, every vibrant shade spread across their blank canvases. It was another world. A world Matthew longed to reach. A world he could create with his own two hands. He returned to their tiny room, rummaging through old scraps of paper and broken pencils that Grandma Rose had found in the trash. He began to draw. He drew everything he felt. The loneliness. The pain. But there was hope, too. He drew for days and nights. The sketches piled up, and his lines grew stronger, sharper, more alive. Rose watched him, pride shining in her tired eyes. "Matthew, you have a gift," she said softly. The boy looked up at her, a flicker of hope lighting his gaze. "Do you think someone would want to buy my drawings?" Rose thought for a moment, then gently nodded. "We'll find out." One morning, Rose took Matthew to a small market where people often sold handmade goods and paintings. They laid his drawings out on a little spot on the sidewalk, in a place where no one was paying attention. At first, no one stopped. People walked by, glanced at the drawings, and then continued on their way. But then, an older man in an elegant suit came to a stop. He stared intently at Matthew's drawings, clear surprise shining in his eyes. "Are you the one who drew these?" he asked. Matthew nodded shyly. The man smiled. "I'm Mr. Richard, the director of a small art gallery in New York City. There's something very special about your work." Matthew's eyes widened. "Special, in what way, sir?" Richard slowly examined each painting, taking his time with every detail. "They're not just pictures. They tell a story. A story about pain, about loneliness, but also about resilience." Rose gripped Matthew's hand tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Then, sir, could you help my grandson?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Richard looked at them both for a moment, then nodded gently. "I'd like to exhibit his work in my gallery. If they sell, I'll make sure he gets his share." Matthew couldn't believe what he was hearing. He was about to step into a different world. He was about to have the chance to change his life. In the days that followed, Matthew painted more than he ever had before. His drawings were hung in Richard's gallery, and then something miraculous happened. They sold out in just a few days. People became curious about the boy with the red birthmark and the deeply emotional paintings he created. They wanted to know the story behind them. Matthew became a sensation in the street art world. But more important than all of that, he made money. Money enough to save Grandma Rose. Money enough to leave Mr. George's boarding house forever. That day, when Matthew and Rose were packing up their things to move to a better place, Mr. George appeared at their door. He stared at Matthew, his eyes burning with anger and jealousy. "Who do you think you are?" he growled. "A freak like you making money? Don't make me laugh." Matthew didn't respond. He just looked at him, strangely calm. Rose stepped forward, her gaze colder than it had ever been. "We don't need to stay here anymore, George," she said, each word crisp and clear. "From now on, we have nothing to do with you." Mr. George's face turned pale. He couldn't believe that Rose, the woman who had once begged him to let her stay, was now saying these words. He couldn't believe the child he had despised had somehow changed his fate. Matthew didn't need to say anything. He simply took Rose's hand, walked past Mr. George, and left the boarding house without looking back even once. And as the door closed behind them, Mr. George felt something inside him shatter. New York City was still noisy and bustling as always, but for Matthew, the city no longer felt cold. He was no longer the abandoned child, no longer shunned by everyone, no longer seen as a curse. He no longer had to avoid prying eyes or shrink back to protect himself from cruel whispers. He had stood up on his own 2 feet. And now, the world was beginning to recognize it. The name Matthew started appearing in small art columns about New York City's street art scene. Some people called him the miraculous boy whose paintings touched the heart. His drawings continued to sell out within days of being exhibited, and Richard the gallery owner began receiving commissions from major art collectors. "Do you understand, Matthew?" Richard looked at the boy with excitement gleaming in his eyes. "You're becoming a phenomenon." Matthew simply smiled, a gentle but powerful smile. "My grandma says, I just need to paint what my heart feels is right." Richard laughed warmly. "Then keep going, kid. Because this world needs exactly what you can create." But while Matthew was steadily rising, those who had once scorned him were now paying the price. First was Mr. George. After Matthew left the boarding house, many other tenants decided to leave too. No one wanted to stay in a place with such an awful reputation, a place run by a landlord who had left an old woman to die because of foolish prejudice. As the building emptied, Mr. George's income dried up. He tried raising the rent to cover his losses, but no one was willing to pay. He went bankrupt. He lost the entire boarding house, forced to sell it off at a pitiful price just to pay his debts. One late afternoon, as the sun was setting, he stood in front of the rundown building, staring at the filthy walls and empty windows. This place where he had once ruled like a petty king. Now, he had nothing left. He clenched his teeth, the name Matthew echoing in his mind. He had never believed in fate, but in that moment, he knew that punishment had finally found him. One day, at a larger art exhibition, Matthew unexpectedly saw a familiar face. James. The boy who had once bullied him. But this time, James didn't sneer. He stood quietly in a corner of the room, his gaze awkward and full of shame. Matthew didn't need anyone to tell him. He could see that James was no longer the arrogant boy he used to be. After Matthew had left the school, perhaps the teachers, the parents, and the other children had realized their mistakes. With no one left to pick on, James had become isolated himself. "Matthew," James finally spoke, his voice hesitant. I'm sorry." Matthew stared at him for a long moment. Then, he nodded. No need for many words. No need for hatred. Matthew hadn't forgotten what had happened. But he understood. Forgiveness was the only way he could keep moving forward without carrying that burden in his heart. One day, Samuel and Camille Matthew's biological parents appeared at the gallery. They were dressed in expensive clothes, wearing luxury perfumes, still carrying themselves with the air of the upper class. But their eyes were filled with ambition and calculation. They didn't come out of love. They came for his fame. "So, our son is quite the talent," Samuel said with a fake smile, looking Matthew up and down. Matthew said nothing. He just stood there, quietly watching the two people who had once abandoned him on the coldest night of his life. Camille stepped forward, her pale, delicate hand gently touching Matthew's shoulder. "We're family, darling," she said softly. Matthew didn't move. He remembered. He remembered that night, when they had heartlessly left him in a dark alley. He remembered the years of hunger, the days filled with scorn, the tears that only Grandma Rose had ever wiped away. Matthew smiled. It was a calm smile without hatred, without anger. And then he took a single step back. "I don't have parents," he said, his voice steady but resolute. Samuel and Camille went pale. Matthew continued, his words as clear as the lines he drew on his paintings. "I have only one mother in this world. Her name is Rose." The entire gallery went silent. Samuel and Camille stood frozen, unable to say a word. For the first time in their lives, they realized they had lost him forever. They might have wealth, but they would never be able to buy Matthew's heart back. A few days later, Matthew made a decision. He bought back the old boarding house where he and Rose had lived through their hardest days. But this time, he didn't let Mr. George back inside. Instead, he turned the building into a shelter for homeless children, a place where no one would ever have to suffer the abandonment he had once known. When Mr. George came knocking, begging Matthew for help, Matthew simply stood there, staring at him for a long moment. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "When I needed help, you turned your back on me." Mr. George said nothing. He knew. This was the price he had to pay. And Matthew, even though he could have sought revenge, chose not to. Because he knew. Forgiveness was the greatest victory. Matthew stood in front of the small house he had bought for Grandma Rose. It wasn't a grand mansion. It wasn't lavish or dazzling like the homes of New York City's wealthy elite. But to him, it was the most wonderful place in the world. A safe place. A place without judgment or cruelty. A place where Rose could spend the rest of her days in peace. He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with love. "Grandma, do you like it?" Rose's voice caught in her throat. She had once believed she would die in a damp, dark room, that she would leave this world alone, never having seen Matthew find his place in it. But now, she knew their suffering was finally over. "I never thought I'd have a real home like this," she whispered. Matthew took her hand gently, giving it a light squeeze. "You deserve everything good in this world, Grandma." Tears filled Rose's eyes. But this time, they were tears of joy. That day, Matthew hung a special painting on the wall of their living room. It was a portrait of Rose, painted in the warmest colors Matthew could imagine. In the painting, Rose wasn't just an elderly woman with silver hair. She was light, she was sacrifice, she was unconditional love, she was everything beautiful that had ever existed in Matthew's life. Right beneath the painting, he wrote a simple yet powerful sentence. "My mother, the one who taught me that love is stronger than anything." Rose looked at the painting, her lips trembling, her eyes clouded with tears. Matthew no longer called her Grandma. He called her Mother. And there was no greater joy than that. But the bright days that followed for Matthew were not just personal victories. He knew there were still so many children out there just like him. Children who had been abandoned. Children who had been shunned, rejected, treated as if they were bad luck simply because they looked different. He couldn't turn his back on them, not when the world had once turned its back on him. So, with all the money he had earned, Matthew decided to open an art center for homeless children. A place where they could create freely. A place where they could express their pain and their dreams through art. A place where no one would judge them, no one would look down on them. A place where he could become the person he had once desperately wished for during his loneliest years. On the day of the art center's grand opening, hundreds of people showed up. Some came to celebrate. Some came out of curiosity, to learn more about the boy who had once been abandoned but had now become a famous artist. And some came for their own selfish reasons. Among them was a couple Matthew never wanted to see again. Samuel and Camille. They entered the building, still carrying themselves with the same arrogance as before. But this time, Matthew could easily see something in their eyes. Ambition. They hadn't come out of love. They had come because of his success. They wanted to use his achievements to present themselves as the respectable parents who had raised a genius. Samuel gave him a fake smile. "Matthew, our son. We're here to congratulate you." Matthew didn't respond. He looked at them, his gaze calm but cold. Camille stepped closer, trying to appear gentle. "You know, we're family. We could." Matthew raised his hand, cutting her off. "No." Camille froze. Samuel's brow furrowed. "Know what?" he demanded. Matthew looked directly at them, his voice steady but sharp as a blade. "There is no family here. You are not my parents. I have no parents." Camille's face turned pale. "Matthew, don't say that. We can start over." "No," he said again. "There's nothing to start over." Matthew clenched his fist, but his voice remained frighteningly calm. "I used to want a family," Matthew said quietly. "I used to long for love." He took a step closer, his eyes locked onto theirs. "But you threw me away. You left me to die in the street like I was nothing. Like I was garbage." He moved another step forward, his voice steady, unwavering. "You don't deserve to be parents. You never deserved me." Samuel clenched his fists, his face flushing red with anger and humiliation. Camille burst into tears. But Matthew didn't care anymore. He turned his back on them and walked toward Rose, the only mother he had ever acknowledged. And as he walked away, he knew he had freed himself from his past, once and for all. That day, as Matthew stepped out of the gallery, he felt something he had never felt before. Peace. No more fear. No more bitterness. Only love, forgiveness, and a future wide open before him. He took Rose's hand gently and whispered, "Thank you, Mom, for never leaving me." Rose squeezed his hand tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'll always be here, my love." The sun was setting in the distance, but this time, for Matthew, it wasn't darkness. It was a new beginning. The story of Matthew teaches us that love and perseverance can overcome all prejudice and injustice. Even when abandoned, even when shunned by society, Matthew never gave up hope. Thanks to Rose's love, he found his way and rose from his suffering. Those who once scorned him paid the price, but he chose not hatred, he chose forgiveness, and he built a better future. This story reminds us that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who truly love and protect us.